Hey, Khensani, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. And just like your name, which in Tsonga means give thanks, if I'm not misquoting that, I'm super thankful that you're joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Very, very excited to chat. Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, so what did you rush from to get to us today?
Yeah, I literally just left work today. Had to put in a little bit of overtime, which for me means not packing up at 4:30 and leaving actually at 5 p.m. So I actually work as a marketing manager for a sustainable fashion brand. That's my 9 to 5 day job. Yeah, do super, super cool, fun, working, increasing shareholder value. Always great.
No, that's really good. I mean, it is a super interesting field as well, and all the changes that are happening at the moment, like very relevant topics. It's part of the tradition on the show that I ask all the guests what your adapt story is, and it's really up to you to kind of pick one or where to start because sometimes there are several adapting points. What is your adapt story that you think has thrown you into a path that you found yourself on or that you're currently on?
I think I have so many little different turning points. I'll start at the beginning when I think actually no, when I was a kid, I was very set on being a wedding dress designer. I really wanted to be a bridal designer. It was my biggest dream. I used to spend all my time drawing all these things. And then a very close relationship with my dad, and he's a big reader, so I got really into reading, and then I really wanted to be a writer, and I even used to run a little magazine of my of my own when I was in primary school, and I would force all my friends to submit stories for it and distribute it around school, and everyone hated it. But I still really enjoyed the writing and stuff aspect of it. So for a long time, I was like, okay, cool. I think I wanna work in fashion media. That's the dream. I watched things obviously that have always Prada and Ugly Betty. And there used to be these reality shows of girls working at Elle or Marie Claire and stuff. And I was like, yep, that's exactly what I want to be doing.
Hmm.
And then around high school, blogging became a thing, and it was sort of this. I saw this one woman, Tabby Gevinson. So at the time, I think she was maybe 2, 3 years older than me, but she was like 30 in front row, New York Fashion Week. She was first name basis with all these big designers and models and celebrities, etc. And all of that happened because she would just post stuff online about her outfits and things that she thought about fashion. And I got really into that, and I really enjoyed it. Um, and then by the time I was finishing school, the fashion media was kind of dead. You could see sort of the descent on the rise, like a lot of the local magazines were closing or there just seemed to be less jobs.
Mm.
So then I sort of pivoted and I was like, okay, cool, I will be a fashion designer again. And then I went to go study fashion design for 2.5 years, and then I dropped out because I just did not enjoy fashion school at all. And I think primarily because I didn't enjoy, or I didn't feel a really strong connection to the way I was being instructed. Just from you have subjects like fashion theory and fashion media and fashion history, and it was this very westernized perspective on everything. You hardly learned of anything that didn't happen outside of Europe and America.
Mm.
The design tasks were also very fast fashion focused, and it was all about commercial viability and stuff, which for me wasn't why I wanted to do that. I think I had always felt for a long time that I'm an artist and I'm so creative, and I'm supposed to be doing things that are edgy and different, and school just sort of seemed like a big waste of that. And then I conned my parents into giving me a little business loan,
Okay.
and I ran. Then I dropped out of school and I ran a fashion brand for like a year, and discovered I have really terrible business acumen. But I think it's also a natural thing that will happen if you give a lot of money and sort of agency to a 19-year-old. That there are going to be some big losses and stuff. And I just decided I think it makes more sense if I still really want to do this to go learn and go work and practice and stuff. And then I spent like a year just doing a lot of weird odd stuff. I was a wardrobe stylist for a while for a choreography company, so we used to go dress all the dancers and stuff for performances, and we used to get to go to all these cool concerts and award shows and dress people there. Also hated that.
Okay.
I don't know if you'll pick up this comment there, but the moment I hate something, I usually drop it. But usually just not from the fact that it's hard. I can just see when I'm just not suited to something.
Yeah.
Even my one best friend that I did the wardrobe styling with, she's still a stylist to this day. She really found her affinity to that. She's really good with people. She's really good at the admin of it. She's really happy to dress people in the way that makes sense to them and doesn't have to be her taste specifically. Whereas I'm a little fashion dictator and I think it has to be what I like. Yeah.
But you know what, actually, what
Uh,
I'm hearing is not that you know, when you don't like something, but you actually are willing to start something else. And that's, I think that's also something really cool.
Yeah, actually, yeah, that's a great way to put it. I'm always ready to start fresh.
Yeah.
I worked retail. I worked as a receptionist at a hair salon for a while, even big lost vibes. And then my dad was just like, okay, I don't like the direction this is going in, and you're getting a bit old. So I think you should go back to school. Just go figure out. Maybe there's just something else you just need to do at school. Just go do that.
Yeah.
So then I went to go study marketing because it just made the most sense in terms of what I understood and what I knew. And then I got to start working in the luxury fashion space, but on the marketing in there, and actually enjoyed that. I felt I had a good knack for communication and that kind of stuff and social media. And then I was writing on the side, and that was going really well. And then the pandemic hit and I got
Mm.
retrenched, which was so good. Just as I found a groove and that's a dip. But it was I know people died, but it was very cool because it gave me a lot of time to really sit and think, especially because I was alone for a lot of it and I was surrounded by my sewing machine that had been covered in dust, and I had all my old fashion school textbooks around me,
Mm-hmm.
and I spent time reading, and then I started retracing stuff, and then I was like, oh, maybe I should just add all this up, let me make some things. And then I got into this. I don't even know exactly what the inciting incident it was, but I just got very into fashion history. I think it started because one day I wanted to make a corset, and then I found someone on YouTube talking about the history of them and how they've been made past to present. And then I was like, oh, cool. I really love the idea of what people would have worn 50 years ago or 100 years ago. And then what did that look like here? Because I actually have no clue of anything pre the 1950s. And that has led into what is still a very long ongoing search now for just an African fashion history and seeing how clothing and attitudes towards dress and beauty have changed over time, specifically very, very specifically, I think, to Southern Africa. I think there's a lot of coverage on West and North and Eastern Africa,
Mm-hmm.
more than you see down here. And it's just like me to pick the most difficult thing to find and get really passionate about that.
Yeah.
So that's my big passion. I think this is the one thing where I found I really like it. And also at the same time, I've always been a little bit of an eco-terrorist and a tree hugger. And actually, as I was learning more about fashion history, I found all these beautiful parallels in terms of the way people used to regard the production of clothing and labor and materials and stuff that link a lot to a lot of the ideas we talk about when it comes to sustainable fashion now. And you'll see this sort of this big trend now where we're looking towards indigenous knowledge. And I think on top of uncovering this history and having this knowledge is also, I think, there are solutions for all these problems that we face now,
Mm-hmm.
especially as like in Africa where we're probably going to be the most bereft and disadvantaged by climate change and all the things that come with it. I think it'd be very cool for then us as people to also be the ones sort of leading the path to fixing those things or making a better world. And I think that was my final adapting point.
Well, thank you. The whole adapting timeline. I actually didn't want to interrupt you because I found that super interesting. It's so loaded because you've really just given us a complete overview, basically, of where you started and where you are now. And there are so many things that I want to ask you about. But what I really found super cool from your content on YouTube, and also I listened to episodes from your podcast. I also just looked at some of your Instagram posts, and what I really liked was that it's pretty clear that at the center of everything that you've been doing, you've basically just been giving things a trial. And I think that really comes across in your videos. It doesn't feel like you are, yeah, like you're trying to push a specific agenda, or you're trying to have things molded a certain way. It just feels super light to me. And also it feels like, at the core of it, there's beauty in it. And I think that's, maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, but is that what you feel you are bringing to the African narrative, especially within fashion? And I think that's also something that's not so easy to do, because you said in one of your videos, I think, and this was my thought as well, because I know nothing about fashion. The closest thing that I know about fashion is I have a family friend who ran a design school, and I would see them doing stuff sometimes, but it really was just all went above my head. And I think I just never really paid attention. But the way you presented the work just made it super interesting. So, yeah, what is at the core of the fashion and the sustainable materials? What is it at the core of it that really resonates with you or helps you to express yourself better than you felt you could in the fashion school you went to?
That is such a great question. I mean, I like that you mentioned beauty because I think that's a big part of it. I think what's always attracted me towards I think anything in fashion because I'm also at a point now where I find almost every aspect of it really interesting, like even the really boring stuff of how people figure out their minimum order quantities or how they made a zip and how they got to that invention and stuff. It's just that fashion as a whole is this one industry where it touches every single person on the planet. Like I think you might feel like you don't know anything about fashion, but you live in that every single day.
Mm.
And there's so many people around you, and you'll have that thing in common with you. You'll get dressed every day. We all have some sort of understanding of how we want to present ourselves or what it means when someone is dressed like a police officer or a nurse or something like that. Like, you know what I mean? It's this beautiful language without words, and it's cross cultural, and it crosses time and space. And for me, it's just like in every single small thing, the way that someone would have put the zip in on your garment, that was labor for them. And that's something that maybe they did that's now supporting their families. And there's all these little stories that you wouldn't even think of that are involved in everything you wear and interact with. And there's also the way that hidden innovations that happen in fashion are the reason why we have other things. Like my friend was telling me recently how gauze, like the name gauze comes from Gaza because in Palestine they were weaving a cotton so thin and fine. And then that's something that's become such an important part of medicine today, which is just so cool. And then it's all again just starts with this thing where it's like you make this sort of at the core, like fashion is this thing that's about beauty and it's this pretty thing and it's nice to look at, but then it can also be revolutionary and it can also be communicative, whatever. It can be a history, it can be a way to preserve a moment in time. It's just this great equalizer to me. And I think also for me, I grew up one of 6 children. It's very you're so when you're in a sort of family that busy and that big, you do feel. I think I've always felt a sense of isolation just because there's just so many voices around you. And it's just this very nice, approachable way to find connection without having to do the scary stuff of talking and that kind of stuff. Or it opens the way to that. And yeah, just like you can never be lonely if you have a nice shirt on or something like that. And yeah, I think that's what I like about it.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I actually don't know how many people are doing something similar to what you're doing, but I think what struck me is that you're connecting storytelling to history, to current trends, to beauty, and all of that within the African context for me is super interesting. To be honest, I think you were talking about the corset, and in my mind, when I think of a corset, I really don't necessarily associate that with an African story. And why do you think that is? I probably represent, yeah, a significant number of ignorant people who actually have not been informed because a lot of our history does not tell the stories that actually existed, but they're just not necessarily shared.
Yeah, I think that's actually exactly it. I think there's this glaring lack of representation. When I started doing my research, it kind of feels like you'd swear black people didn't exist before the civil rights movement or the 1920s. You know what I mean? I mean, it's taken me a while now, but it's very hard pressed to just find a photo of any African person in Southern Africa. Let's say 1899 is the year to see what a regular person looked like. Whereas, I mean, there's obviously an overrepresentation of Westerners and stuff. And I think, I mean, obviously part of that is sort of there's the aspect of advancements in technology because obviously also this is also because Westerners and colonialists and imperialists get to sort of dominate what records are kept and what get to be shown.
Yeah.
But also obviously for a long time, if you wanted to have an image of yourself, it would be in a portrait, which would have been reserved for a long time for royalty and nobility. And then even when photography was invented, that was still a very rare thing to do and was still pretty expensive. And if you were going to get your photo taken, even as a regular middle class person, that was probably something you did like once or twice in your life, and you'd wear your best clothing for that because I mean it was a process that took really long and you had to stand there.
Yeah.
And then obviously you can imagine that even for someone who's painting scenes like landscapes or whatever, you're not probably that invested in portraying what's happening with African people or the people you consider below you or below your class all the time. Or you're not perhaps super invested in representing them in the most accurate or favorable light. What's also interesting to that point is also that the thing I've sort of been discovering also is that we sort of always deal with that narrative of how we don't have a written history. Like we, you know what I mean? We don't have records and archives and stuff, but it's just sort of the medium is different. If you look at sort of the history and tradition of, especially I think a good case of this is like West Africa, all their indigenous cloth, all the stuff they do in terms of weaving and embroidery, that is their version of a textbook or a monument. It's not the sort of typical museum and huge scrolling and scrolls and stuff that you'd see in the West. Not that that doesn't exist either, but it's also different mediums. But yeah, again, it's just sort of like who gets to be represented and why at any certain point, and obviously the agendas of the people behind what gets to be shown.
Yeah.
Which also sad because also if you look at a lot of these historical images of Western people from the 19th century, the 18th century, etc., a lot of their clothing is also made possible by African people. So there's also this element of not only do you not get to see those people in those clothes, but you're seeing the products that they've made, but you'll never associate them with it because it's like they're just these two separate entities.
Yeah.
When they're so actually quite linked.
No, absolutely. I mean, I saw a reel the other day about black cowboys in America and how that has also sort of been, wiped from history, or it's not necessarily shared as much. And you're right. I mean, the medium, our museums for our kids in the future will probably be some of the content that we're sharing. So that's really important that we are sharing these stories. So if it's so difficult to find historical records, how do you do your research? Like, is it all just web-based? How do you put it all together? Or do you use also walking samples of history from people who lived in that time or people who are descendants? What is your data collection process? I'm curious.
Yeah, it's actually a lot of different things. So a big part of it is like web based. I look for some really good archives in certain places. Like I've recently gotten access to a few local ones, like the South African Museum. I believe they have the Bleak and Lloyd collections, and Bleak and Lloyd, where they were linguistic academics, and they were responsible for recording Khoi and San languages in the early 19th century. And then as a side product of that, they also took a lot of photographs and they documented the clothing and material culture of all the different tribes they interacted with. So that's you sort of have to end up in roundabout ways to find certain things. I read a lot of people's dissertations and articles, and it might start out with something very silly. Like one that I'm really enamored with was about the spending habits of Dutch women in the Cape Colony in the 18th century. But from that, I found like a few odd paragraphs and mentions of emancipated black women at the time and what they were wearing and also what they weren't allowed to wear specifically, because there were these very strict sumptuary laws, because there was a huge problem of materialism and excess in the Cape Colony as being one of the richest colonies at the time, where it became very offensive for the colonial elite that formerly enslaved people could work their way up and then also dress as well or better than them. So small things like that. Then there are some really good image libraries that you can find. There was a big sort of trend of a lot of European photographers who would come here to South Africa and document different tribes. I mean, obviously, sort of the lens that they're looking at it with wasn't super great, and I don't suspect that everything was captured super accurately. Obviously, with the language barrier and all the other isms that come into play. But, byproduct of that is there'll be images and there'll be text descriptions and there'll be portraits and drawings and sketches. And from some of those things, we can glean certain ideas, things like that. Sometimes it's also just looking at the case of what materials were around and would have been necessary. So I'm going to go back to the Khoi and San because I've just been reading up on them recently a lot. But they have like sort of minimal clothing to the Western gaze, right?
Yes.
But a lot of that is based on sort of just working with the materials that they had. So they wore a lot of leather because they would get that from the animals that they hunted for food and other materials. They would use things like ostrich eggshells in their jewelry and accessorizing their stuff because that was in abundance. And they have a sort of to blanket statement their culture, they have a very in tune, holistic view with nature. So everything they take from nature, they give back. Like they don't believe in sort of unnecessary waste, and everything finds value somewhere. And then also as nomadic people, it also makes sense that they're not going to wear millions and millions of layers because they have to carry that stuff and move.
Yes.
So you also like have to do that kind of deductions. And also, I mean, I think also recently in recent years, fashion history as a field of study has grown quite a lot. So you do see a lot more books and texts now with people sort of addressing those aspects specifically, as opposed to lumping everything under, oh, they made this pottery and then they also had these beads, and also thinking about the fact that the beads are worn items, so they also have certain context and furthering that study and stuff. So yeah, it's all over the place.
Yeah.
I'm also hoping to get more into speaking to people. Would be, I think, is really cool, because I think there's also a lot of stuff that would probably get lost in oral history that isn't necessarily always written down and stuff. So I think that's definitely my next goal, is to just actually sit with some graddies and transcribe things and hear from them. I mean, even the few things my mom has told me that she remembers of her mother wearing back in the day. You know, like a woman always wore a petticoat and always wears stockings.
Yeah.
And that's pretty useful to me. And I'm like, oh, cool. Like, yeah. So yeah, I pretty much wherever I think I can find something, I'm there.
I can imagine that you're summarizing it now, but this is a long process. I'm just wondering, what are some of the side effects or after effects that you never imagined before? For example, the connections to your own identity and curiosity, perhaps, about your identity and things that you maybe thought were a certain way that are actually not the way you imagined.
I mean, I think the biggest thing I've learned in recent years, and also I've had to have a sort of uneasy acceptance of this, is you grow up with these ideas of things that are traditional, right? So as a Tonga person, people wear shivelanis and stuff, and then even like my dad's side of the family, Spedi, and there's like all these bright, beautiful colors, and this is the clothing of your ancestors, and this is what we've been doing forever and ever. But actually, that's not true at all. A lot of these actually are often, or the way they look now, perhaps they were originally there, but maybe the way they look now are colonial byproducts, or the results of having to have been moved from your land, or becoming urbanized and things like that.
Oh, really? So I'm
But
super curious
yeah,
about
like,
that because my mom's side is also Tsonga. And are you saying Shibelani is not actually what is the story there? I'm curious.
I mean, that one I'm still on an investigation about, but also from what I understand, I think I mean, also the materials that were used for it. So things like wool, I believe, and anyone can correct me, but I don't think there was an excess of sheep that would have been cultivated for that purpose. If you think of 19th century Limpopo or something, it's more likely that would have been maybe out of like grass or something. I know that they were trading cotton with other East African countries, so that's also a likely possibility.
Mm-hmm.
But even when it comes to the colors and stuff, um, for a long time, I think up until the 19th century, any sort of dye you do fabric had to be derived from natural materials,
Yeah.
and most people would go with the things in their environment. And if you look at the flora available in somewhere like Limpopo, you're not going to get all these bright blues and yellows, and yeah, the color palette probably would have been a lot more closer to like dark rusty reds and
The red
oranges,
sand and the, yeah.
So it's interesting stuff like that perhaps, or just considering how this might have looked like a long time ago. Um, Even things like shweshwe, everyone sort of regards as a very traditional fabric, but that's a Indonesian printing technique that Dutch companies got really into, and then they ended up bringing it here, and then through a process of sort of forceful and then just a gradual adopting and acceptance, it's become this go-to fabric for that kind of thing. Yeah, or even something like sutu blankets. That one is a bit shocking to me. They used to, obviously, historically, that whole thing would have been made from animal hides and animal skins.
Mm.
And then I think it was in the 1840s that German missionaries introduced European-made wool.
Yeah.
And then that's how they've ended up looking like that today. Yeah, so many of these things have these sort of different stories. But I think what I've sort of come to learn or accept, because I think there's a part of you that wants the purity of a thing.
Mm.
Do you know what I mean? You want to find out what people were actually wearing when they weren't being forced to live a certain way. Like, I want to see exactly what, if we had to go to the 1699 in the area we now know as Limpopo,
Yeah.
what would that have actually looked like? And I mean, there's slim chances we may ever really know, but that also doesn't sort of devalue the product that happens now. I think there's also something to be celebrated and admired about the things that people were able to hold on to, the things that they adapted and made their own, and the things that they transformed for their own purposes, and the things that they've taken back from their oppressors or from people around them. And also the things that also come to sort of symbolize a shared experience and a shared unity. You know that fabric they use from Njeka, that floral.
You mean Shibelani material?
Yeah, so that's like a cotton, but like the printing style also, it's Southeast Asian. which I think is interesting because Indonesia were also a Dutch colony as well around the same time as we were. And I think as yeah, and then instead of sort of thinking of it as, oh my god, this is the result of people coming and being forced, and also that's kind of cool that we have this little shared thing with people who also had a similar experience or had to overcome a certain kind of pain as us, and then that's also the beauty of it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we also can't, just because we want to have, like you said, the purity of the story or a certain image, I guess we would be doing the same thing that the oppressors did. It's like try to kind of paint a specific picture, but this coming together of different cultures is actually also not the worst thing, I guess, like you said, and there are some positives. So I'm actually just wondering, I'm fine being the poster child of the standard fashion ignorant person, well, fashion history ignorant person. So in my mind, when I think about fashion, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, from a South African perspective, because we had so many cultures that also settled there, and just I have this image of the Khoisan, right? That representation of them in the bush, and then I somehow just sort of leapfrog from that to to I'd say the 60s apartheid time, maybe 50s.
Yeah.
And in between, I don't actually have a fashion picture. Can you please fill in the gaps for me?
I'll fill in some of the gaps, but I'm also facing some of the same blanks. And I'm glad you put it like that because yeah, I know, it does feel like there was like this beginning time and then the
Boom.
20th century. Like,
And then we were wearing petticoats and stockings
yeah, just completely out of nowhere.
and worker clothing thingies.
Yes, and then overalls and then three-piece suits and things like that.
Yeah, because I think this is actually very different from, say, like West and East Africa. I have this picture and in my head, but this picture doesn't necessarily have these gaps. And I think that also has to do with some of the homogenous cultures that they had. I mean, I know that there was a lot of diversity even within their cultures, but compared to South Africa, with the mixing of cultures, we really had, yeah, far and wide in terms of culture mixing. So I really do think that's relevant, and I'm glad that you agree with me.
Yeah, no, for real. It's actually interesting that you bring up sort of like the mixing of cultures aspect because I think I've been reading this book recently on sort of a South African look at beadwork and different beadwork. So they've got a chapter on Ndebele beadwork and then one on Zulu beadwork, and they've got something on Tsonga beadwork, on Xhosa beadwork. I think there's some stuff on like Tswana beadwork, Swati beadwork, etc. But the one thing they also bring up is this is kind of like a side effect of apartheid is this idea that also I think so they sort of proposed that a long time ago it was not let me say homogenous, but it was pretty accepted that there were a lot of transferable ideas. So there was a time where there wasn't sort of a specific distinct Zulu beading style or a specific distinct Xhosa beading style. It's very normal that some of the symbols or colors and things would have passed over, and that maybe things might be unique to because of maybe you're in a bit more of a farm, remote village or etc. But there weren't these strict hard rules of if you add this and this, then it's no longer Zulu or something like that.
Yeah.
And I suspect the same thing has also happened with our clothing, and I think that's also what makes it a bit more difficult to find this knowledge as well, is because if everything doesn't fit into this very strictly defined category, then it doesn't have value to our current understanding of what makes these different cultures.
Yeah.
Whereas I think, and also again, this is very broadly speaking, but I think when I look at like places like Nigeria, it's very common to see all these very different overlaps between Yoruba and Igbo styles, while also still understanding each one is also still quite different, but they are sort of a greater shared identity, and I think that also helps with preserving.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I mean. It's like they are diverse within a spectrum, but the spectrum is not as wide as I'd say in South Africa. And that's probably why I mean, I know for a fact, for example, that my grandmother or my great grandmother didn't walk around in a shibelani all day. It's something that is worn for specific events or something special. And I'm actually wondering, what did they wear apart from maybe their work overalls or whatever else? So that's maybe some inspiration for a video you can do, the gap, the South African gap.
Yeah. I mean, I can say like broadly speaking, I mean, so the cool thing about fashion is you can always use other things as context clues. So we can go by who, like obviously where they lived, so what are the materials available to them. So in that case, you'll obviously get a lot of case of leather, clothing, or animal hides. And then also depending on who they got to trade with, then we'll know some groups would have had access to cotton, etc. It also depends on whether they were the kinds of people who could do weaving as well of their own. So obviously something people like the San, as nomadic people, wouldn't be carrying around looms to weave fabric on, but they might trade with other groups for fabric that's already been made. So, but again, it's also hard to place these dates. But this is very broadly speaking. But it's there's a lot of sort of aprons, or let me say bottom coverings that you see across men and women. And generally, from what I've seen, at least from across the Zulu and even Dzonga and your other Nguni tribes as well, is you get the shorter bottom covering or apron for men and then a longer one for women. And then usually also, I mean, everyone is pretty much topless. And then that covering of your chest would come with marriage, etc. And there's also obviously different adornments and bangles and cuffs and things like that. I think also pretty far and wide thing you see is also different kinds of headwear. So from big sort of hats and things, like if you think of Iskolo, to little headbands and things like that. This actually does remind me, I read this thing. There's this one really great fashion historian, South African fashion historian, Erica de Groof, and she looked at these young Xhosa boys' pants that they would wear when they were going for initiation and going into the mountain. And part of you becoming a man was also, I think, the understanding that you're also going to have to go. So let's say this is like 20th century, I think, you'd also have to go into the cities and go into urban areas and get jobs. So a big thing was to get you a pair of formal pants that would fit in that urban setting. But then they would also combine these pants with like traditional beadwork. So I can't remember who was responsible for doing this beadwork. I don't remember if it was something your mom did for you or if the other men in your community did for you. But then they would take these like Western slacks, like these cotton or wool slacks, and then they would embellish them with all this beadwork. And this was a gift that you got as part of your initiation into manhood, and then also sort of acknowledging it's this cool sort of bridging of this historical traditional past that you have to leave, but also it's a place you also have to leave physically at some point, and then also that you're leaving sort of metaphysically as a boy to man, and then also having to cross into this new world where you have to contend with meeting this urban westernized setting, and then also still trying to hold on to your roots and your culture in a way that sort of fits all the different functions that you have to go into in life. Just think that's interesting, yeah.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, I feel like I'm literally taking notes. You don't see it, but my brain is like I've got that processing, taking notes going on. And I'm actually just really curious, what do you think the value of sharing, historical fashion is for someone like me who is, or maybe somebody like you, okay, maybe not you because you're making the content, but whoever your whoever your listener follower is, because I find part of the appeal to me of following your platform is that you are a black woman. Like that to me makes it it just adds a layer of interest to me that I feel maybe would not be there as much as it is now, simply because you represent somebody who I look like. So I'm really curious about who are you trying to share these stories with and why.
It's very funny that you also ask who, because I think the last time I checked, the majority of my audience is American, which is so funny to me because I think I guess my intent has always been, I think I primarily want to share it with people who look like me or have sort of similar background as me. I think, I mean, because like sort of from my perspective, I've always felt a little bit of a cultural disconnect. You know what I mean? It's funny because you can speak the language, you can be around the people, but you can also feel like you're not super connected to all these things. And my family isn't super, we're not super, I mean, we had a very Christian upbringing, and we live in a very urbanized setting, etc., right? So you don't have this like, I don't have this super deep tie. Most of my grandparents are also dead now, so I don't have that resource as well. Unfortunately, I realized too late, so I don't have that sort of resource. That's okay, thanks. But yeah, I don't have that resource to easily rely on. And I also imagine when I've spoken to some of my other friends as well, I think it also feels that way. Like, I think sort of the most immediate people, like our parents, had a lot to deal with. And, there's certain things you have to adapt and move on with. And I mean, I don't think everyone wants to enjoy speaking about apartheid as well, or all the things going on there either. Um, right? And also obviously different lifestyles and different changes, obviously you start to value certain things, etc. And I think also maybe for them, when you already know the thing, it doesn't feel maybe as vital as it might be to when you're a bit distant from that. And it also works cross culturally. Like I know lots of people also who are like in the diaspora, etc., who also just feel like they've got this sort of disconnect,
Mhm.
and there is a sort of sense of identity and belonging that I think you can sort of start to find in learning these things.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think it's for anyone who ever feels that sort of way. And then like I said, I think fashion is the most accessible way to start this sort of thing. Because I mean, it's pretty difficult to learn a language or pick a language up again, or to go to a place, and actually be there and live there.
Hmm.
Particularly like in our modern world, where you also have to go work for corporate overlords and deal with inflation and things like that, and the allure of modern life, like iPhones and doom scrolling until 4 a.m. and stuff.
Yeah.
But fashion history is a beautiful, approachable way that because everyone has a fashion history to their culture, and it's also as a side effect reveals so many things about like religious beliefs or value systems, and what matters and what doesn't, and what's etc. important. And it's a really nice entry level, and then hopefully that can lead on to whatever more self discovery you will have. And it's just a value for the things that we get to wear and share and pass down and keep with each other. And I'm gonna assume maybe that's also part of why maybe I have such a huge American audience. I'm assuming it's probably also a lot of people like Africans in the diaspora wanting that sort of connection of that kind of thing. But I also think for most people, okay, yeah, I'm gonna go from whatever sort of feedback I've received. But I think a lot of people just like once you get to know this sort of little inkling of someone's culture, it really humanizes them in this really easy to
Mm.
approach way. And I think it just helps you just realize how alike you are to people that you might not have felt very alike to before.
Yeah.
It's all just human connection at the end of the day.
No, absolutely. I mean, just a comment on that. Like I feel there's so much value just in documenting it. Like you said, back then there were museums, but then those museums only really kept records for specific people. And so I feel like adding the more stories that we add to the narrative is also a space for different types of people on the spectrum, on the African spectrum, I mean, because I do feel like the spectrum of what it means to be African and what it looks like, in my opinion, is really it's growing more and more and more. And the more stories and the more perspectives we have of what an African person can be like, or what an African person can be interested in, or what an African person experiences, I feel like that's so beautiful.
Yeah.
On its own, it's enough, and whether or not that's the receiving end, whether or not it's an American person or a South African living in Germany, it doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, you are keeping a record that hopefully your children will look at and other generations to come. And so I really like that. Whereas before, you probably needed to go to a museum or find a professor who specialized in this, and often this 60-year-old white guy who was really curious about these beads somewhere in Lesotho. You know what I mean? Like, whereas now,
Yeah.
having you sit across me and tell me stories about my own culture, which I just don't know, is so valuable. And I'm also just wondering, there was one video that I saw, which you made a comment earlier about how, we don't necessarily want to go and look at everything that's just about apartheid. And that's part of this beauty element, and the beauty and the lightness of African culture, which is what you're doing. I think history can be quite heavy sometimes, especially because mainstream history on Africa is like slavery, colonization, poverty, all these things that are relevant.
Oh,
They are very relevant themes, but they can be heavy sometimes, and so this is, I think, a really nice way of telling stories and also giving historical facts, but from a very light and beautiful perspective as well, which is super intriguing and interesting to me. And that also brings me to your birthday celebration that you had, where you where you were designing a gown. Can you tell me about that?
this year or last year?
I think it was last year because you had a Princess Tiana gown.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes,
Okay.
yes, yeah. Yeah, that was actually very inspired by my mom. So my mom, I think ever since she turned like 35, so every 5 years she goes like all out with her birthday. Yeah, but yeah, and also her rationale just being obviously she grew up really poor and stuff, and for her it's this, and it's also it's kind of similar in the vein of what I like to do. It's just this chance for herself to celebrate herself and also put herself in this dignified and beautiful position and celebrate that. So last year when I was turning 25, I was like, okay, I want to also go all out, and also because I'm growing very certain day by day that I'm not going to get married. So I'm like sort of, and I didn't have a 21st or a sweet 16, so I don't have those big moments for you to have some big crazy party. And then also through my mom, so I don't think you have to wait for all these milestones like a wedding or whatever. Just do them when you want to do them. And I have always loved Disney princesses. And actually, the Disney princess I've liked the least was Tiana. But she is the only black one, and I was like, okay, I wanna celebrate Tiana. She's so cool, and I liked the one blue dress that she wore in the film. Also, part of why I've never liked Princess Tiana was because her film is set in the 1920s, which for a long time as a decade I did not vibe with. Like, you cannot talk to me about a boyish cut and no waist definition. Like, I don't want to hear it.
Okay.
Like, I'm not interested in that. But there's the one scene in the movie where she goes to like a costume party, and then she's wearing that beautiful blue gown, which to me seemed very similar to the sort of silhouette that you would see in the end of the Victorian period. So like the 1890s, the 1880s, which is a period I really, really like. So I was like, okay, that's kind of like best of both worlds. So I will just do a slightly more historically accurate take on what Princess Tiana was wearing to that ball, with the sort of fan fiction or like headcanon of, oh, her mom was a seamstress and her mom obviously would have been altering things, so maybe she found one of her mom's. No, I think her friend gave it to her, but I think her mom did stuff with the friend. But it's an old gown from then that they had repurposed at some point, so she's going to repurpose it again for her little the party that she's going to. And I think I spent like 2 weeks on that for my birthday. And then I, like 4 months in advance, I told all my friends we're having a very serious themed birthday party. You cannot arrive without being dressed.
Yeah.
Send everyone a mood board with images, inspiration, etc. I said, call me when you're at the costume hire store if you need like consultation, like, you know what I mean? Which is really cool. Yeah, I was like, I went all out. Yeah, I had to work like a dog for almost a year before that to save up, and then I hired a mansion to do it in, and balloons and everything. Got my dad to play the saxophone. And then I also did a second outfit change because I didn't really want to be in a long ball gown the whole night. And also my mom, at her 50th birthday, she had 3 outfit changes, so I thought I was going to beat her.
Wow.
But she obviously doesn't make her own clothes, so I only managed to make 2 outfits for the party. And then my second one was inspired by this like photo I randomly came across at an auction, which was of a dress Marilyn Monroe wore in this movie from 1956. And oh my god, I was so obsessed with this dress for so many months, and now I'm forgetting what the movie was called. And she wears it in this movie for, I think, all of 15 seconds, which is super unfortunate. And there are no images of the back of this dress. There's just one image of it, of the front, when it was being sold at auction. Very minimal detail on who made it, what it's made out of. She wears it in the movie like 3 seconds, and the whole time it's covered by a guitar. There's also the fun things I like to do is try and investigate and make guesses and come up with sort of, doing a lot of little detective work to produce that. And that one I had a lot less time to make, but then that was my second outfit for my birthday party.
No, that's really cool. Thanks for sharing that. I mean, I know, like you said, it's maybe a good thing that you mentioned that you worked for like a dog for a year to hire the mansion, the Victorian mansion in Cape Town, but it looked really cool. I absolutely love that. And I think that's also an image that's very important to share because, I don't know, it also, once again, brings forward the different faces of African people, and often in mainstream media, especially for women, the strong woman image, or, African people also being portrayed as physically strong often, that whole narrative, and it takes away from the lightness and the celebration and the princessy vibe. So I think that's really great, especially for maybe a young girl that's watching that. And how do you feel then now within your context, the South African context? Do you feel like everything that you're sharing and learning is relevant for you now, apart from your identity and just your daily life? How is the fashion history changing your interactions and how you fit in and how you go about your life in Cape Town?
Well, Cape Town's an interesting one. But I think on the one hand, I like it because I think I think it's just so much easier to relate to people a lot more now. So like what I've liked since I've moved to Cape Town as well, because There's also a huge sort of textile history here, and it's sort of a history that I think is sort of the backbone of a lot of colored culture, especially a lot of most modern colored people today, like their ancestors, be they Malay or Indian or all the various different parts of Southeast Asia that they may have come with, also intermixed with all the people here, etc., and also people brought in from other parts of the continent. A lot of these people were laborers who were making clothing, and that continued for a long time, to the point where most of the clothing factories that you see now in Cape Town are highly populated by a lot of colored people.
Yeah.
So the fun thing is I can kind of talk to almost anyone, and they'll tell me about an aunt or a grandma who used to work in a factory or something like that, which is really cool. And then you can hear things that even at my day job, we work very closely with this very small clothing factory, and it's owned by this mom and daughter, these two very lovely colored ladies in the Cape Flats, and they have just their entire family history is people who've worked in clothing production, which I just think is super cool. And it's just so much easier to have a little chat with them, and then I can, while I'm learning things as well, I can also connect with them and talk about, oh my god, tell me about your family history and things like that. I also find that I feel like now I can understand people a little bit more. Like now I talk to my best friend is Xhosa, and I think a lot of times she would go home for a wedding, and these things kind of like go over my head, because I'm just like, what does that got to do with me, you know? But like now I can say, yeah, and I can talk to her and her mom and her aunts, and I'm like, yeah, tell me about the hijab, but what does this mean, and what's the difference between this and that, you know? And then I also get a greater insight into someone who's been my best friend for years and years, and you know, there's a side of her that I probably would never even have thought to ask about, or she might never have thought to share about, because it's just, you know, we're not seeing the connections between these things. I think that's even cool. Even with white people, actually, I think is an interesting part, because I think we also forget that when, you know, while in order to create this sort of homogenous idea of whiteness, a lot of people's cultures had to get erased, you know, to create one blanket white people. But I mean, there's a difference between the way Dutch people do things from Austrian people, from Germans, from French or other Scandinavian people do. And again, another interesting just point to connect with and touch base on, and also show people that also you are also terribly affected by white supremacy, even though you also do benefit from it quite greatly. Yeah. It makes being in a rainbow nation a lot more interesting, I think.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. I mean, also just being in Germany, I think it's the probably the least flattering fashion hub of the world. And for someone who I'm super minimalist, but even I'm like, come on, guys, just make an effort. What is going on? I feel like that's also a really big trend nowadays. The hobo look like you just don't care theme.
Spend a lot of time in the morning to look effortless.
Yes, exactly. Take as much time to show the exact opposite of that. I feel that's just also really interesting, because it's how our society in general is shifting. And whenever I come home, I see more and more of that influence back home as well. Like where I think specifically with the youth, I mean, I'm still part of youth.
You know, you're a teenager until you're 37.
Yeah, exactly. My brother is actually 17 years old. So it's quite interesting for me. I'll see him wearing oversized jeans and random tops that I think I feel like if he finds someone's top and he'll just put it on and you're not sure.
And meanwhile, you might not know that it's like Carhartt or something.
Yeah, exactly. And then he'll just top it off with some beads or something like that. It's super interesting because it looks cool. And I'm just wondering, what is your take on the emergence of a new culture, a new fashion history that's taking over now?
I think I would say, so I see sort of there's two sides of it. There's like what you're speaking about, the sort of like domination of effortless, minimalist, like just less color, less adornment, you know, no nonsense clothing,
Yeah.
you say, or just sort of this like, and I blame, as always, you can always sort of find a way to blame Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos for something, but I think there's sort of this idea as we all become very serious, grind set, hustling, like, you know, we're on the money people, there's sort of this perception that, you know, the time and effort, or looking like you put in the time and effort to getting dressed and putting things together in a way, one obviously is just sort of a distraction from the time you could have spent working. Particularly if you look at like, the billionaires we have now, billionaires just don't dress like they used to, you know what I mean? Like, I do not want to see an episode of MTV Cribs with these people, because they're so boring. They don't care for color and things like that, you know, they just want to make everything sleek and white, which in itself I think is also, it's kind of sad, because I think in the past like 20, 30 years, the people who've probably embraced color and adornment the most are often people of color and poor people. And the moment that stuff becomes a lot more accessible, then all the upper classes have to move to the direct opposite of that. But
Okay.
also at the same time, I mean, yeah, the internet's done wonders. Like every kind of subculture that you could ever imagine to exist exists.
Yeah.
And I've seen also with a lot of, I think a lot of young people nowadays, I'm even going to make myself sound old, but I think also because there is just this abundance of information and media now, everyone is very desperate to distinguish themselves, which is also why you get these very kooky, crazy combinations, and you start to see
Yeah.
like coastal grandma and frazzled English woman core and 90s whimsy goth and I wish I was making these names up, you know what I mean? Like real aesthetic subculture
The thing
stuff.
is, as you're saying them, I have these images popping into my head. My brain is not surprised. It's like, oh, that's what you call that.
Yeah. Yeah, actually. But on the one hand, I think it's fun. I think it's really cool. I think a very important thing is for any person to like explore and experiment. And
Hmm.
if you have the means to and the ability to do it quite responsibly, you should try out everything until you figure out the thing that works for you and whatever your own distinct thing is and whatever helps you fit in and also out of a group. So it's sort of like two sides. And I think also the more things get extreme, you're going to see sort of more people wanting to really retreat into the grays and the just sort of simple suits and stuff. And then there's also this, I think there's also this creep as we have a growing uncertainty for the future. There's just this continuous rise of nostalgia. It's so crazy,
Absolutely.
like how much that just, everything just keeps coming back. And maybe I'm also part of this same sort of development as well. But there is just something about looking to the past when the future is so uncertain. But I like it because I've seen, but also maybe because I hang on very niche parts of the internet, but sort of this rise of people just getting very into olden stuff and things that are very niche and specific to them. There's a guy I love on YouTube and he just discusses men's tailoring before the 1940s and he talks about all the rules and the ethics and the etiquettes of dress and how things were made and the different material innovations and stuff. And he has a community of like 1 million followers or something like that. And I think, you know,
Wow.
it's just a fun thing to return to and it's kind of simpler and there's sort of all the answers are there and it's something you can get into yourself because it doesn't move as fast and you still sort of have this assurance that it's classic and stuff and you can still make it new in your own way.
I think you've made some really good observations. And I think it comes back to the point where we started, where you said, fashion is a part of every fiber of life, really, because you've touched on the feelings of the times, like the old coming back into the new. You've spoken about the aspirations of the poor versus, like class. And so I feel it's actually a really nice way of wrapping it up, but I feel these are really good observations, and I absolutely nodded my head on the inside and outside
Yeah,
for
speaking
each
of,
of
I
them.
monologue quite a bit, so I'm always like, hold on.
No, that's good. I mean, I do like to give you the space to do that because I feel it's also just that's part of why I'm here. But I really appreciate that as well. And I absolutely resonate with a lot of the points that you've mentioned. And it's, I guess, at the end of the day, there is enough space and room for all these different stories, and I think that's part of maybe the story you and I are telling in our different platforms, is that there is enough room and space for every shade, every style, and I think that's super important that you keep representing the things that you find interesting, whether that's from a current trend or from history. I think it's super valuable. So yeah, I really just want to appreciate you for being here today and also sharing. Your monologues have been really good. I feel like it's actually been a conversation more than a monologue.
Okay, good.
So yeah, I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Also, you've made me think about some things I haven't had to think about, so that's super cool.
Actually, maybe before I do stop, there was something that I wanted to ask you. Have you maybe looked also at some African princesses? I think that would be so cool to do.
Yes, actually, oh my god, that's like a dream project.
No, but like seriously, I feel like that would be something super interesting. So if you want a free model, I put my my hand up
Okay,
because I guess
I'm taking
you
notes.
probably have to do a whole representation of the different types of people that could have been princesses back in the day.
I would love to do that, honestly. That's like, oh my god, I would, yeah, that would be super amazing. If I could do, even if it was across the continent, like all 54 nations plus,
Yeah,
that'd be super amazing. Like, maybe let me just start with South Africa. Let's see, maybe all the different
exactly.
tribes or something.
No,
But that would be, absolutely amazing. Like that'd be super cool. Definitely. Yeah, but again, also that's the thing of also I just want to learn everything as well. I want to be able to, obviously figure out the right figures and also get. It would be really cool to get exactly what they would have worn and work with different practitioners and artisans on recreating those things. It'd be cool to get people who've been doing like leather crafts for years and years and like tanning the animal hides and things like that. And yeah, okay, I'm gonna go into a huge tangent.
No worries, no
How
worries.
exciting that is.
But yeah, just thank you so much for joining me today. I had a really good time. Like I feel this is maybe one of the most interesting topics I've covered because I feel it's so outside of my domain and my daily life that it's something that I was just really taking notes on. So thanks so much. And I am a bit of a nerd, so I would totally watch a documentary that you do. So yeah.
Your lips to God's ears.
There you go. But I'm wondering if you were to have a magical ball, where do you think you would like to be a year from now? So if we're having this conversation exactly 1 year from now, what are we talking about and what has changed?
A year from now,
Mm-hmm.
do you know? Actually, I mean, I still going back to when I was a kid. It's always been my lifelong dream to have a book. What that book would be is the only thing that's stopping me because I've sort of had the opportunity a little while ago, but I was like, I have no idea what it would be, and I really want to do it justice. But that would be like if this time next year I could be in the process of finalizing a manuscript or something like
Mm-hmm.
that, that would be amazing. I think I know I will have the opportunity to also connect with people sort of doing similar things, whether it be on some sort of collaborative project, on
Mm.
hopefully something that's also community based. I would love to take all this knowledge and put it somewhere
Yeah.
that's accessible and free for people to share. If I could build my own library, that'd be so fun. Even if it was just a digital one or something like that.
You
Yeah, but I really want like a good formal one, and I want so many contributors, and you know what I mean. I think it'd be super cool. I want it to be a place where I'm also coming to learn something new, and also that's super accessible to people. Like, don't just follow me on Instagram or something like that.
I guess today is your sign, your reminder to
Yeah.
get on that. But I look forward to talking about your book. I look forward to hopefully having a coffee in person. That would be great. So yeah,
Yes. Whenever you're like, yeah, yeah,
Khensani, thanks so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It's been so good.